Welcome to the College Checklist Podcast, everyone. This is by March Consulting College Planning and Higher Scores Test Prep, where we make the confusing chaos of the college admissions process simple. As we enter this new era of testing and admissions, we are bringing you a new guide to application season with a whole new team of experts and guests. Because so much has changed in the world of college applications, testing, admissions, which can be super overwhelming for people who don't have an entire workday's worth of time to scan every new alert to figure things out. But we do. That's literally our job. So that's where we come in. So any question you might have, we're going to cover all of it. And if we don't cover it this season, we'll definitely cover it in a future season. So let's meet the team. Do you want to introduce yourself first?
I would love to. Hi, everybody. I'm Christina Friedman. I am an independent educational consultant with March Consulting, and that just means that I help students and families navigate the college admissions process. I do specialize in STEM-interested students, so most of my students are in science, technology, engineering, math, but I do have some pre-med majors, some pre-law majors. I've worked with film majors. I've worked with English majors. I previously came from teaching in our local high school district. I taught math for over 10 years. I was a part of the curriculum development teams that they would put together over the summer to work on lessons, assessments, curriculum for all of the schools in our district to use. And all along the way, I was also doing subject-specific tutoring. So if a student needed help with algebra, or if a student needed help preparing for the math on the SAT or the ACT, I would work with them as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about you, Julia?
Yeah, so I'm Julia Clausen. I'm the test prep expert here. My official title is that I'm the director of online programs at Higher Scores Test Prep, where we currently have SAT, ACT, and soon PSAT courses. But I also have AP literature and language teaching experience as well. I've been teaching those tests for almost a decade now. And so now I develop the curriculum and design the courses for Higher Scores, since I am just one person and cannot be tutoring every single student who needs it. And then I do work directly with students, hosting live review sessions, answering questions for our self-paced courses, etc. So I am on the higher level and also working with the students day to day. So between us, I think we've got a solid amount of experience with the subject matter.
Both halves of the brain, the English and the math.
Yes, exactly. I think together we make one complete expertise with what we need for this podcast. So a lot has happened since the last season of this show. The last season of this show was to help students and parents through test prep and admissions during COVID, during the pandemic. And a lot has changed in this whole field since that time, and partly because of it and partly just the direction it was already heading. So what are some of the things that can you even summarize what has happened since 2021?
Yeah, real quick, let me just describe the last 3 or plus years.
Yeah, piece of cake.
Stanford's school application has students answer some short answer questions like, what did you do for the last 2 summers? But it limits them to only 50 words. That's like three
Right.
sentences. Or what's the biggest problem facing society in 50 words?
Right.
That's what it feels like.
Right. Right.
Let me just quickly recap.
Yeah.
But no, I can kind of summarize. So it started with kind of a sudden shutdown for most schools at the end of a school year. And that meant that a lot of students missed some really important concepts there at the end of that school year before starting the next school year, possibly in a distance learning situation. And yes, schools did have that summer to kind of prepare for that distance learning year. But for a lot of schools, it was a brand new approach that they were kind of, again, scrambling to be prepared for. And there was a lot of a learning curve during that time, trying to figure out how to take lessons that were very hands on and very interactive and present them from a distance learning approach. And a lot of schools knew that their students might struggle, and perhaps it wasn't fair to expect them to complete as much during that school year. So then we saw them maybe cutting back some of the concepts that were covered that next year. So between losing at the end of that previous school year and having maybe their subjects pared down for the distance learning year, it's perfectly understandable that many students fell behind, and not just because of the curriculum. There's also the mental health aspect of what was
Hmm.
going on there, and a lot of students just don't thrive in a distance learning format. So there was a bit of learning loss, as we might describe it, during that time. But we did eventually make it back to in person learning. And at that point, teachers were faced with this dilemma that they knew students were coming in, probably a bit behind. They needed to perhaps catch them up. They also needed to be fair and reasonable about their expectations on how those students might perform, having just experienced all of that. So, again, you might have seen curriculum that was trying to squeeze in previous information and therefore cutting new or just paring back again. Um, and not only that, in terms of the content, but also this affected the grade policies all along the way as well. So, teachers developed some policies during the distance learning, like allowing late work at all times, or allowing students to retest as much as needed to demonstrate their understanding. And a lot of teachers decided to maintain those policies going forward. Even in person, why not let students turn in late work anytime for full credit? Why not let students demonstrate their understanding by repeated attempts at a quiz? Which is great, which is very considerate of the students and their experience and giving them the opportunity to demonstrate that understanding. But also, sometimes this led to a lot of students having similar GPAs, a lot of students having similarly decent GPAs, but maybe those GPAs weren't as direct a representation of their understanding of the subject matter at that point, because concepts had been cut, because concepts had been lost. So we have a lot more students with similar and high GPAs, uh, though maybe lacking a bit when it comes to the understanding that those GPAs are supposed to represent. So when it comes to the new crops of college applicants, colleges are looking at school by school, state by state, all across the country, this wave of kind of grade inflation to some degree, and trying to figure out how they can fairly identify the students whose GPAs are perhaps a better reflection of their understanding than others. Um, which is why test optional or standardized testing in general continues to be so beneficial in the application process, allowing students to include their test score if they want, can give a student an edge by showing that that GPA, that high, that perfect GPA, is in line with their conceptual understanding, because when tested on concepts, they performed as well as they did on that SAT or ACT to back it up. So it lets students position themselves, set themselves apart from the crowd, while not adding any penalty if a student chose not to include their test score. Because there were many instances where students were unable to for a long time, and then testing was in such high demand that they weren't able to get seats when they meant to in time. So, schools have been adapting to this test optional approach and figuring out how they can fairly assess students in either situation, how they can accommodate for that lack of a test. And one of the new elements to how they're analyzing that information is perhaps a bigger emphasis on your test score compared to your local high school students,
Mhm.
rather than comparing test scores across the country from students in different high schools who made different choices during all that chaos. By comparing students to their own classmates who had similar educational experiences and opportunities, they can really appreciate the students that shine in that kind of subset of their applicants. So, in a nutshell, that's what we've been dealing with in
Yeah.
the admissions world since the pandemic. And then there was another big shift at this time, not necessarily related to pandemic chaos, but the presentation of the digital SAT, which I'm going to turn it over to you, Julia, to
Yeah.
tell us more about.
Yeah. So the ACT was working on a digital test and had done examples of it prior to COVID. And then suddenly there was this urgency with distance learning to have digital versions available. Um, and the ACT kind of fumbled it a little bit. And then the SAT sort of came up from behind all of a sudden and was like, here's a digital test. Everyone's going digital within the span of 2023 to 2024. And so now the SAT and PSAT and all AP tests, all College Board tests are now completely online, hosted through the same app called Blue Book, which you have to like download yourself. It's not a website. And it's fairly user friendly, but it can be glitchy on test day when like everyone in the country is trying to use it at the same time. Um, since College Board doesn't have like a giant secret bunker full of computers for students to uh, take all of these tests on College Board's devices, they are trying to now, with the digital test, move away from Saturday national testing, um, because they don't want to have to provide you the tools that you need in order to take the test on this new platform that they've created, which to me is a little messed up. But they just logistically, it's easier for them if students are taking the test at their school, where then the school is liable for providing the devices to all of the students, which of course creates some inequities. You know, which schools have these devices, have Chromebooks or iPads or whatever for their students already versus schools that can't afford it. Um, and now is it just will it be just kind of a requirement that all schools have these devices so that students can take the test as Saturday testing decreases? It's been logistically complicated as well as just like the test is quite different. We're going to be getting into the details of exactly how it's different um, in a future episode. Uh, don't worry. I'm, but just in general,
Because
the
to be
rollout
clear,
has been complicated.
there were a lot of changes. It's not just the same old test in a digital
Exactly.
format. So we'll talk to all the extent
Yeah.
of what you should expect now.
Yeah. There's totally new questions. There's a new structure. There's a new scoring system. It's a complete overhaul. It's almost not recognizable as the SAT anymore. Um, so yeah, we do not have time to get into all of that here. And then since then, the ACT has been trying to re-roll out its digital test and has very recently announced that they will be completely redoing their test as well. Not quite to the extent that the SAT has. Um, Essentially, what they're doing is they're trying to make the ACT more customizable. So the digital ACT uh, has a lot more accessibility features than the digital SAT does. Um, but it's not quite as readily available to enroll to take that test because the ACT is doing a paper version and a digital version, and they're trying to offer as many options as possible. And in that customizability, the people hosting are the ones who decide which versions they offer. And one of the other big changes that they've made is they're going to make, starting in 2025, in kind of a gradual rollout, they're going to be making the science section optional. So, similar to what they did with the writing. So, students can add writing, or they can add science, or they can add both, or they can do neither. They can do digital with all of those options, or paper with all of those options. So, there's like a bunch of different versions of the ACT that a student could potentially take, depending on the type of program they're applying to and what's going to make them look good, is the idea. They're also reducing the number of questions. And for the math, they're getting rid of the fifth multiple choice option. They're reducing it to 4. So they're trying to compete with some of the more desirable aspects of the SAT while also making themselves slightly different, in that students have a bit more agency over what their test looks like. Um, so we'll have more information on that as they announce it over the course of the next 6 months or so. So that's sort of the overview of testing. And you've talked a bit about what has been happening up until this point, but what does the, like, again, very difficult to summarize briefly, but what does the like future of admissions going forward look like? What are some of the things we're seeing?
Right. Because some of these changes were in response to the pandemic and some were not. Like the UCs and the Cal States made the choice to go test blind, meaning they're not going to look at a test score as a factor of their admissions decisions anymore. And that's likely to stay the same because that was not a pandemic response. Some of the schools that went test optional during that time found that it really benefited their application pool and process. It meant that they had more students to choose from because some students used to self select when there was a test score required. They thought, well, gee, if I can't get a perfect score on the SAT, I guess I won't apply at all. And less students were talking themselves out of it because of that with test optional. So they got more applicants, they got more talent to choose from, more application fees out of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So they're likely to continue that. And the nice part is, many of those schools doing that are some of the schools that are offering that merit aid, those scholarships that have nothing to do with need. So that's really great that that continues to be an option for students. In the meantime, every day, another really highly selective school announces that their test optional period is ending, that they are going back to requiring test scores. They say that during this time, they did research on the effectiveness of these scores in terms of helping them identify the right applicants, and that their research did support the use of test scores as a great way to help identify students, regardless of geography and income. So they are often announcing that they are going back to test required. MIT requires a test. Um, Stanford is going back to requiring a test. So it is still in students' best interest to be looking at considering preparing for taking these tests. Some schools, having taken that test score out, or at least potentially out if they're test optional, responded by adding more essays into
Mm,
their application to kind of compensate for that lack of information.
mhm,
So students are seeing perhaps an increase in what we call supplemental essays, where they're asked to give a little bit more information about themselves or some aspect about themselves. But by and large, what this did was increase selectivity, really in all colleges. So schools that did not used to be so selective started to increase and become more selective. And of course, the most selective schools just got even harder to get into because of all of these changes.
mhm.
And on top of that, we've also been seeing an increase in college costs all along the way. So, more applicants, meaning harder to get into. And now, if you do happen to get in, it could be a pretty hefty price tag depending on the school and the scholarship situation. With schools like Vanderbilt in Tennessee getting close to that 100,000 a year mark for students.
Absolutely unreal.
Crazy.
That is so ridiculous. Yeah. Yeah, because
But
doesn't
a lot of
the acceptance percentage being really, really small, doesn't that, like, make a school look good on ranking or
oh
whatever?
yeah, yes, yeah. There's a lot of rankings out there, U.S. News and World Report and Forbes, and in most cases, all they're measuring is selectivity, which is just a measure of how many spots they had compared to how many applicants.
Mhm,
And it doesn't tell you that their program's any better or worse. It doesn't tell you that it's an ideal fit for an individual. It just tells you it's a pretty popular school for whatever reason.
mhm. So we've got a lot to cover this season. We've really got our work cut out for us. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about, so you can know what to look forward to. We're going to start off talking about like what's going on with testing. So we're going to talk about the new SAT, the new PSAT, and sort of reviewing the whole national merit process, because as schools get more and more expensive, getting a head start on any access to scholarships is going to be really crucial. And we're going to be talking about those test optional policies in a bit more detail, because there's a lot of variety in how schools and students are responding. Then the rest of the season, we're going to be talking about admissions. So, and the application process. So, putting together an application game plan, choosing a major, applying to different types of programs. So, military academies, STEM programs, humanities programs, arts programs, the audition process. And finally, we're going to cap it off with how to make college affordable. Now that you've applied, presumably, what can you be doing to get access to those scholarships and that merit aid and that whatever other financial aid? So um, we've got a lot, and we're not, it feels like we're barely scratching the surface with some of these conversations, but we're very excited to cover all this so that you can have access to this information. Best of luck with everything.
Absolutely. Okay, and that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to contact Julia or myself directly, you can send admissions questions to me at info@mymarchconsulting.com and testing questions to Julia at hello@higherscorestestprep.com. Those will be linked in the show notes below, so you can grab those there. If you would like a free college planning consultation, go to our website, mymarchconsulting.com/services, and check out higherscorestestprep.com to take our SAT versus ACT quiz, or maybe download our free guides to the SAT and the ACT, or heck, get crazy and sign up for a test prep course that we offer. This has been the College Checklist Podcast with Julia and Christina. See you next time, and thank you for
Bye,
listening.
everybody.